CityCast from Explocity.
We called it the lottery to go to America. It was a list of 1,000 names. How did the Tibetan government officials decide who got on this list? Did they fold thousands of names into thousands of tiny rolls of paper, mix them up for good measure, and pick out 1,000 lucky winners? Before the lottery, the only lotteries we knew about were school raffles, which my brother Tendor had a knack for winning. His luck held through several years of raffle drawings before it vanished abruptly and he stopped winning. One of the last things he won was a pair of beautiful black ankle-high leather boots that all the female teachers had their eyes on. Later, they came to our apartment to try them on. They were elegant, comfortable, enduring. The leather was soft and flexible, and the zip smooth and seamless. The shoes must have been Italian. Back then, even if you had the money for such luxurious items, which of course none of the teachers had, you couldn't have found shoes like that anywhere in India, even in the bazaars in Delhi. One by one, each woman tried to slip a bare foot into a shoe, and one by one, each gave up in resignation. The toes were too narrow, the arch too high, the ankle too tight. The shoes would not fit anyone. Cinderella's shoes, my mother said. So, those were the lotteries we knew, school raffles in which the most you won was a teddy bear or a pair of shoes that fit no one. Lotteries such as my friend Sonam buys now, the Powerball with tens of millions of dollars for the winner, and the scratch tickets that my mother likes to buy and scratch out, the meager winnings always slightly less than the initial outlay. These were unknown then in India. Shows such as Kaun Banega Crorepati, the Indian version of Who Wants to Be a Millionaire, were unthinkable. India was still recovering from the economic slumber of its socialist Nehru years, its markets opening slowly to the world. Coca-Cola, which you could find all over Kathmandu, had yet to come to India. On the rare occasions that we could afford soft drinks, we drank the local imitation Thumbs Up and wondered how it measured against the original. India was poor, and Tibetans poorer still. The idea of a lottery that made you rich, a lottery that gave you a new life, was not just ridiculous, but subversive. And then it came, the lottery to America, the lottery that split our future. We knew our future. We would have our parents' refugee lives, our parents' exiled futures. We would grow up, graduate from our Tibetan boarding schools, go off to Indian colleges in the great cities of the heartland, make friends with Indians, but not too well, because it wasn't for us to make love or war with them. And then return to our Tibetan settlements in the north or south to work in our own schools and communities, in our own government. With America came the possibility of living outside these settlements, the possibility of unsettling. With America, the future split infinitely.
A few weeks ago, I was reading LitHub, one of the many literary magazines that I enjoy greatly, and I found a piece that caught my immediate attention. It's titled, Literature in the Bardo, Tenzin Dickie on the Past, Present, and Future of the Tibetan Essay. Not only was I captivated by her prose, but importantly, that piece opened up a window to the world of Tibetan literature. Now, growing up in India, Tibet exists by default, if nothing else. We know a smattering of things about that country and its culture. There's the Dalai Lama. There are the Tibetan settlements in Dharamsala in the north and Bylakuppe in the south of Bangalore. And we know that the Tibetans came here to run away from Chinese occupation of their country. Inevitably, there's someone who tells us to go to that Tibetan doctor and that their system of medicine is the best. Things like this make us believe that we know Tibet more than we really do. It gives us a sense of familiarity, but no knowledge, really. Well, you don't think much about it other than maybe feeling happy to have been a shelter for someone in need, especially when that someone is the Dalai Lama. But the LitHub piece sent me running down a delightful rabbit hole. My guest today is the author of that essay, Tenzin Dickie, and you heard her reading an extract from it. I would describe Tenzin as an exceptionally gifted writer. Her latest book is titled The Penguin Book of Modern Tibetan Essays, And the stories in it present a wonderful window into the Tibetan soul. These stories are both touching and strong, and you begin to appreciate not just the mind of the minority, but also the mind of a minority in exile possibly forever. Tenzin edited this book, and with this and whatever I read about her in my research, I'll venture that she is the new custodian of the Tibetan tale. I have spent the last week happily immersed in Tibetan literature, and I have a ton of questions for her. And so here she is, joining me from her home in Boston. Tenzin Dickie, welcome to the Literary City.
Thank you so much for having me here, MGM. It's an honor.
Oh, it's my honor entirely. Okay, let's start. Your piece is titled Literature in the Bardo. So to begin with, what's Bardo?
Bardo, okay, there are several different terms for it, but it's basically the intermediate stage. It's like the in-between period between one life and the next.
Mm-hmm.
It's that period, generally supposed to be about 49 days of like wandering in limbo, which means it is a period of loss, but it is also a period of possibility because, who knows what comes next.
You're talking about rebirth.
Yes, exactly. So that period between one life and the next.
So I take it that you're using Bardo as an analogy to describe the in-between period between one stage and the other stage of anything.
Yes. Yes, absolutely.
And I'm saying Bardo, but you pronounce it differently?
No, that is exact. So we say Pardo, but yes, Bardo is I think now how like all non-Tibetans say it. That's exactly right.
Okay.
And it's especially with like George Saunders Lincoln in the Bardo and like the tricycle and all of that. I feel like Bardo is now it's become also, it's not just a Tibetan term anymore. It's now an international term.
But after all this total immersion that I've been in, why can't I be an honorary Tibetan?
We would like you to be an honorary Tibetan. We need more Tibetans. Only, 6 million of us.
6 million, that's my neighborhood. In your highly quotable essay, you write, modern Tibetan literature written in the in-between in the Bardo is a literature of interrupted continuities. Nice line. And you go on to say, we are writing in the Bardo in the in-between transitory period between our old life and the new towards the future. So in this case, by Bardo, you're talking about this in-between state. Quite literally, you mean the state of exile, don't you?
That's exactly right, because that's what exile is. Exile is a period of Bardo. I mean, we've now been in exile for over 60 years. So beginning from 1959, in the early 60s is when Tibetans started leaving Tibet to go into exile.
Okay.
Not just for a better life, but also, and not just to escape communist Chinese forces, but also to rebuild and regroup and to then emerge as a stronger nation. When I say Bardo and exile is a period of loss, but it is also a period of possibility. One of the things that for all that we have lost, we've gained democracy.
Interesting.
Which is also, so much to do with India. And when you look at India and like the relationship between Tibet and India, Tibetans have taken so much from India, right? I mean, Buddhism, which is sort of like the Tibetan lifeblood, so came to us from India. And, Buddhism is this like sort of amazing technology that we took from India. And I feel like now with the occupation of Tibet and the subsequent period of exile, we came into India, and now democracy is another technology that we have adopted, in our case, from India. And it's, for like the average Tibetan, Buddhism is hugely important. But of course, like democracy, when you look at that, like what more important technology for living is there? So, it's been 60 years. it's quite strong.
Right, I understand.
And I know a lot of people actually have, like a lot of people look at Tibet and China and they think, oh, China is so strong and so huge and Tibet is so tiny. And look at all that has happened. Like how will anything ever change? But Tibetans are still, we're still hopeful.
Hopeful of?
We have not given up the idea of independence, and we still hope for independence. And, we are a nation in exile in waiting.
And while you wait in the Bardo, does exile become a state of mind, like a state of being, subliminally?
I think for all Tibetans, exile is where we live. And that is not just for Tibetans living in territorial exile in India, in South Asia, in the United States, like wherever, exile and diaspora now, right? But even for Tibetans inside Tibet,
right?
Even while they live on their homeland, on the Tibetan plateau, which is overtaken, in many Tibetan cities now, there's way more Chinese than Tibetans. Even inside, Tibetans are still living in exile. And you can see that actually very clearly with some of these essays, especially one that talks about how the writer who now lives in Beijing can actually, can he ever go back home? And it turns out, maybe he can just never go back home again.
Ah, yes, I remember that essay very well. The Man Who Can Never Go Home. In fact, in that essay, the author brings up Milan Kundera, whom sadly we lost very recently. But I remember this interview that Kundera gave to Granta magazine back in 1984, in which he said, "If you are a small nation, though, you do not make history. You're always the object of history." Do you feel that?
It's an incredible line. Something that the writer Junot Diaz said has really resonated with me, and it has to do with reflections. So basically, he says, how vampires have no reflections in the mirror. And he talks about how, the ideas, monsters in fairy tales have no reflections in the mirror. And he says, when it comes to human beings, if you want to make a human being into a monster at the cultural level, deny them any reflection of themselves. And, that was our experience growing up in exile. And of course, not just for us Tibetans that grew up in exile, but also inside Tibet, because so much of our literature and culture was destroyed, like our monasteries, which were our universities and also our libraries. They were all destroyed and ruined and smashed and all our books burned and all of that, right? So we basically grew up among these ruins and then had to reconstruct. So it both inside Tibet and definitely outside in exile, growing up in survival mode. It was it's this big rebuilding project. And growing up, we didn't have books where we could see ourselves reflected. We didn't have people. We didn't have our people telling our stories because we were too busy building roads and trying to survive. And now, in this generation of exile, we finally have all this flourishing of literature and art because there is space for that now. We have kind of settled enough to be able to build and regrow. But of course, we're in a constant state of unsettling.
And what is the diaspora's coping mechanism?
Strong community and communication must be central to your efforts, correct?
Absolutely. And one of our main coping mechanisms is art and literature and culture.
That's great.
That is our coping mechanism.
Okay. There's so much to learn, so much that we don't know. Anyway, to quote your quotable essay, you're right. The essay has a long affinity with exile, with distance and loss. And you go on to say, if this type of traditional Tibetan literature is concealed in time, a certain type of contemporary Tibetan literature today is concealed in place. Texts that are meant to be read and comprehended not hundreds of years later, but thousands of kilometers away. Explain this to me.
Okay. So I was basically referencing this genre of literature that we Tibetans have, which is called Dharma literature, treasure literature. And it's these texts that, Tibetans believe the Buddhist master Padmasambhava and his consort, who's this like great Tibetan heroine and also writer, Yishit Tsogyal, basically took these texts. She wrote these texts and then concealed them. And the idea was, these are Buddhist texts, but the time was not yet ready for these Buddhist teachings. So the idea was like, but hundreds of years later, people will come along, treasure discoverers will come along, and then like find these hidden texts and reveal them. And I just love this idea of, Tibetan treasure discoverers, like they don't discover like gold and diamond or like oil. They discover texts.
Cool.
It's just how precious the idea of literature is and has always been for Tibetans. Literature that came from a different time. And when I was thinking of modern Tibetan literature, it felt to me like treasure literature is something that, you discover in time, right? And it felt to me like so much of modern Tibetan literature is literature that you discover in place.
Such as? Give me an example.
And I had a couple of examples that I was specifically thinking of, but one of which is, of course, like I was referencing earlier, Hashem Gel's essay.
Right. The Man Who Can Never Go Home. And the other?
So that was like specifically something that I was thinking of when I was thinking about modern Dharma literature. But, the early examples of Tsawang Yeshe Pemba's book and Gendon Trempel's books, these are like early examples of 20th century Tibetan literature. And Gendon Trempel is, he's famous 20th century figure, a great iconoclast and thinker, and just this like heroic figure of Tibetan literature. Like his masterpiece text that he wrote, Off Travels. And it's this book that, Tibetans now love and revere and kind of hold up as a great
Wait,
text.
Are you talking about Grains of Gold?
Yes, that's right. Grains of Gold.
I read the whole thing.
Wow, you went down the rabbit hole.
Mm-hmm.
You went down the rabbit hole.
Mm-hmm. Delightful one.
Yeah. So Gendon Trempel wrote that text, but Tibetans didn't really discover it until like 50 years later.
Wow.
Because, he wrote it and then the Chinese came, the Tibet was invaded. He died in Lhasa. The book just kind of disappeared. And then only in like the 90s was it finally published. So it was a book that was just lost in time and in place.
That makes so much sense. Now, the last of my questions on exile, you wrote, Tibetans write in code. Explain.
So, okay. Any Tibetan writing inside Tibet today has to write with like a very careful eye to the censor, right? There's so many things that you cannot say.
Mm-hmm.
When Tibetans talk about 1949, 1959, like the invasion, the occupation, like that whole period. Obviously, those are words that like you can never use.
Right.
Like you would immediately get thrown into prison, right? And like your life destroyed. So people, the terms that people do use sometimes are like, when time was overturned or like the time of change, like time of turmoil, like, or they'll just say before and after.
Wow.
I find that beautiful. And you can trace in it like this whole genealogy of Tibetan writing, which when you can trace the genealogy, it means so much, especially because for Tibetans, so much of the time, and especially now, like, a lot of our genealogies have been cut off, right?
Right.
Like with Gendon Trempel and then with Tsawang Yeshe Pemba. I mean, she was writing in like 1957, but Tibetans weren't aware of his writing.
And that's a pity.
The thing is, because of these incidents in history and because of these ruptures of history and because of occupation and invasion and exile, their writing didn't have time and space to grow the proper genealogies of writing. And when you think about that, that's ridiculous. That is kind of insane, and that is a loss for like the history of Tibetan literature. It's a loss for the history of modern Tibetan literature that we now have to try and reconnect and like recover.
And your book of essays is a great example. There's some really good writing in there. I'm speaking about pre-translated in the original. Would I be right?
Yes. There's a lot of great writing.
And forgive my ignorance, but respectfully, not to take away from the trouble of exile and so on, but is there much other writing than this, like general fiction, like literary fiction, spicy murder mysteries, maybe?
So there is like a proliferation, a flourishing of short stories.
Good.
Like I said before, there's like this like explosion of poetry. But in terms of what you say, genre writing and like these different kinds of writing, that I think we're still kind of waiting to like it's starting, but we're still waiting for more.
You know, when I was researching to talk to you, I read an article which expressed surprise that Tibetan women were writing more in literature. Why is that? Is that for the same reasons the rest of the world would say that?
Probably. Well, there is, yes. Tibetan, like, you know, all cultures was a patriarchal culture.
Right.
We're becoming much less so. Another great development of exile.
I actually, that's the reason I asked, because it's very hard to maintain such patriarchy in a situation when it's an exile.
When the men have lost everything.
Exactly.
Right?
Exactly. That's
like a state of equality is much easier when no one has anything. You all have equally nothing.
Equally nothing. Well, exactly. That's what I thought. Oh, more women in literature. Are there any bad girls in Tibet?
I do want to talk about Tibetan women in writing, actually, and I would say Tibetans have like 1,000-year literature, right? It's been like over a millennia of Tibetan writing, and it really has. We've been a true people of the book. There's probably been more writing by a person per square kilometer per mile than like other cultures, like right.
Oh,
like
how interesting that is.
And the cult of the book and like the love for literature and writing, it's just immense. And all of that was, in service to Buddhism and in service to the Dharma, so to speak. I worked for a Buddhist library and archive, and in our database of over 6,000 Tibetan authors, over 1,000-year period, okay? Like maybe 3% of these authors are women. That's like over this long, immense period of Tibetan history.
And that's principally because?
When you look at our institutions, they were all male-focused and male-dominated, right? All our great like monastic institutions,
monasteries,
where that were the centers of learning.
Right, completely.
So who's teaching there? Who is being taught there? Who goes out and becomes teachers and writers? It's all men.
Right.
And actually, with exile, our centers of learning shifted from the monastery to the school. And all of these schools are, of course, like completely co-ed.
One thing that struck me from the essays, particularly women, but men also, was that there was no sense of victimhood. Instead, I got a lot of strength and hope.
For Tibetans and for Tibetan writers, both men and women, we have such a strong sense of solidarity among Tibetans because of what we went through with the invasion and the occupation, and now coming into exile, and what we are still going through and living through, which is exile and rebuilding and like sustaining ourselves, right? Because this is still our Tibetan nation in progress. So I think because of that, we have a deep sense of solidarity with each other, and a love for our people and our culture and our history, that I think really holds us together. And we look at each other and we can see we're all in this together.
That's wonderfully profound. So tell me, on the business of translating, does the idiom travel easily?
Yes and no. Okay, to give you like a very specific example, right? The writer Hashem Gyal, who wrote The Man Who Can Never Go Home, being in exile from his village / his country. So that word in Tibetan that he's using is lungpa,
Okay.
which can mean village, which can mean town, which can mean homeland, which can mean nation, which can mean country. So as we're translating, I had to make the choice of, what word, this like multifarious word in Tibetan, which captures so much. When I have to choose the word in English, like what am I going to use? And I ended up using all of these different words in turn. That is how Hashem Gyal is able to, right? And you can see like that's the code that he's using in that piece of writing.
It's fascinating. How do you say his name again?
Hashem Gyal. It's LHA. So Hashem Gyal. Hashem Gyal.
I noticed that's how you said Lhasa.
Actually, you and Lhasa exactly right.
I did?
Yes.
Let me try this. Hashem Gyal.
Yes. Perfect.
Well, thank you. And speaking of whom, there's a passage in his essay, which I really liked. It's the analogy of the kite, and it reads, "The relationship between an exile and his country is like the relationship between a kite and the kite flyer." He says you remain attached to a string. Now, are you attached to a string, or are you more the compiler of other kites and other strings?
As much as I think I want to be totally free and like just fly off into the sky, yes, I think I also am attached to a string. And, and that string is, it's the land, it's home, it's Tibet.
Well, on that note, I wish free Tibet becomes a reality. But I would also like to paraphrase an old Tibetan proverb and say in closing that in the meanwhile, in the Bardo, may you beautify the magpie and compliment the pine. Did I screw that up? I thought it's about waiting.
That was great.
Whew, thank goodness. Well, on that happy note, Tenzin Dickie, thank you so much for being my guest today on The Literary City.
Thank you so much for paying such deep attention to Tibet and to Tibetan literature.
And that was Tenzin Dickie, author and editor of the book, The Penguin Book of Modern Tibetan Essays. There's a link in the podcast description to where you can buy that book. And I will be back with What's That Word? That delightful segment where we look at words and phrases that we use all the time, but never stop to think about, right after this. Well, I'm back with What's That Word? And here she is, my co-pilot.
Hello, my name is Pranati, but you can call me P. That's P with an A, not another E.
Hello, P with an A. And where are you in the scheme of the world today?
Going over your interview with Tenzin in my head.
Does it hurt?
Hey, watch it. But that was such a fun interview.
Thank you.
Anyway, did you spend all week reading all the Tibetan literature you discussed? Must have taken up all your time.
Yeah, I did, but I could think of less improving ways of spending my time.
Less improving, such as?
Oh, I don't know. Maybe watching 3 concluding episodes of The Blacklist on Netflix.
Was it any good?
Loved it.
So what happens? How does it all end? Was the secret revealed?
Yes.
Well, pray tell. Spoiler, please.
Yes, okay. The butler did it.
I never see this coming.
Well, you know what? I'm glad they ended the show, though. It was getting a little long in the tooth. 10 seasons.
Wow. Yeah, well, anyway, back to Tibetan literature.
Mm-hmm.
Tenzin mentioned George Saunders in the context of the Bardo.
Yeah.
What exactly was that reference?
Oh, that was Saunders' book, Lincoln in the Bardo. Booker Prize, I think 2017.
And of course, you've read it, haven't you?
I have. I mean, like everyone else, I scrambled to read the new Booker winner.
I haven't read it, but it's an interesting concept.
Totally. You know, Bardo is the stage between death and rebirth, you know, when there's consciousness but no physical body, right?
Right.
You know, apply that to Abraham Lincoln, like lay that upon him, and you have awards juries peering from around the pillar, prize at the ready.
Yeah.
Hey, but I know that you were reading George Saunders recently.
I was a swim in a pond in the rain about 4 Russian writers. I absolutely loved it.
I must read that. Okay, cool. All right, P with an A. What's that word?
So you ended your interview with Tenzin and quoted a Tibetan proverb, something about magpie, was it?
It's beautify the magpie and compliment the pine. You know, it's relevant because it has to do with something about while you're waiting. Bardo, get it?
Yes, I do, and I'm impressed.
Well, don't be. I went looking for one in the Tibetan Book of Proverbs.
Well, I'm impressed that you took the trouble to read a Tibetan Book of Proverbs. That's what I want to talk about.
What?
Proverb. That's the word for today.
Interesting. Okay, great. Let's go. You know, everyone has had proverbs hurled at them right through their childhood, right?
Yeah.
But do you know the meaning? One layer below the surface, of course.
Yes. I looked it up just a few minutes ago. So here's the wiki version.
Okay.
A proverb is a simple and insightful traditional saying that expresses a perceived truth based on common sense or experience. Okay?
Can you be more boring?
Oh, are we here to entertain?
Yes.
Okay, now that I've nailed the meaning, the etymology, please.
All right. First, the reason that proverbs interest etymologists is because language is a window to a culture. It's truly what sets it apart, right? And when it comes to expressing a society's values and beliefs, nothing does it better than a nice proverb.
That's very well said, sire. Very clear.
Well, the etymology is rather straightforward. You know, the word has PIE roots, you know, PIE, which you insist on calling pie.
Yum.
The PIE part would be the pre, or as it became pro, you know, as in goes before. And verb is the same as word, which is very common Latin, right?
Latin? Sure, very common.
Well, cut it out. Okay, anyway, so pro plus verb is literally word put forward. Or less literally, an offering of wisdom, like an adage or a maxim. And in Latin parlance, proverbium.
Interesting.
But from there, a slippery slope as always. In the 12th century, it became proverbe in French. And then it found its way to the Old Testament, you know, the book of Proverbs.
Okay.
And the Century Dictionary and Cyclopedia, published in 1889 in the United States, said that...
Cyclopedia? Is that the same as encyclopedia?
Don't ask difficult questions.
Gee, thanks.
The Century Dictionary quoted its 13th century meaning as a wise saw, often set forth in the guise of metaphor and in the form of rhyme and sometimes alliterated.
Ah, cool.
But by the 14th century, the word became quite common, like all things familiar, and it became, and I quote, a byword, reproach, or an object of scorn.
Is that why you refer to yourself tossing out a Tibetan proverb as hokey?
Oh, thank you for bringing that up and reminding everyone.
Sorry, but in the interest of erudition...
Oh, erudition, schmerudition. Now, I think our work here is done. I'm out of here. But to quote another Tibetan proverb at you, for the man who yearns to depart, he hasn't the heart to linger.
Well, I have a proverb of my own.
Yes?
It's from my parents' generation, actually. Bill Haley and the Comet. See you later, alligator. Bye.
And that is our show. I'd like to thank my guest Tenzin Dickie and my co-host Pranati P with an A, Madhav, and to all of you for listening. And before you go, let me remind you to hit that subscribe button, leave us some likes, leave us some comments, whatever they may be. Apparently, these things help us a great deal. So have a wonderful week, a wonderful weekend, and till next time, have fun.